6-packs and a big bag of ice. 2 6-packs and a big bag of ice.
Hey everybody, it's Bobby from New Jersey back for another video, and today we're going to revisit the topic of quick disconnects and look at some of the different ways to plumb your brewing system and why you might want to choose one product over the other. Now 2 years ago I did a review of the Camlock disconnect system, which is also called Cam and Groove disconnects. At the time there were several other disconnects that were popular within the homebrewing community. While the professional brewers were sticking to the sanitary connectors just because of the nature of a production brewery. You know, you have to have sanitary connections. For homebrewing it's not really that important, so triclovers are pretty elegant, but they're also kind of clumsy, and I did mention that in my last review video. And at the time, Camlocks were relatively new on the scene of homebrewing, and that's what these are. These are Camlock systems. Now, they solve a lot of the problems with all the alternatives, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but really it's the value that we're looking at. You know, these are stainless steel, so they have the longevity of some of the most expensive disconnects that are out there. They have silicone gaskets on the inside. Some of the earlier ones had black rubber, but now they all come with silicone, clear silicone gaskets. You can't even probably see it in there because it's clear. But there's no concern about the gaskets anymore. A disconnect set, the mating pair will run you around $10, give or take $1. For those who are unfamiliar with the Camlock system, I'll explain it pretty quickly. The mated pair consists of two parts. One is the male part and the female coupler part, and the gasket's down in there. So here's the sealing surface of the male part. So you put that in there and you pull these arms back, and two cams on these arms sit inside the groove and pull the two surfaces together against the gasket. All right, now each of these parts comes in several different varieties. This one is the type F, which is the most common for attaching to your brew kettle. So if you have a ball valve coming off of your brew kettle, you thread this into the front, and that's the drain port now of your vessels. All right, so this also comes in a type A, which is has female threads, pipe threads on this side, but this side is exactly the same. And there are some devices that would thread onto. You can thread the type A onto a pump that has male threads on it, and you could also thread that onto a plate chiller that has male threads. So there are a couple different applications, but the type F is the most popular by far. Now on the coupling end, it comes in a couple varieties as well. This is called the type C, and it's the coupling with a hose barb on here. So that's the easiest way to attach a hose to the coupling system. This is the same coupling with female threads, and then, I'm sorry, that's a type D. And then the type B has the coupling end and male 1/2-inch pipe thread. So those are the three major varieties of the coupling end. Now you can attach a hose to all three of these in various ways. So the first one I already showed you. You just push the tubing over the barb and throw a clamp on there, and that's the fastest and cheapest way to go. All right, because you're only buying this one fitting and attaching the hose, and then you throw a clamp on and you're good to go. Here's the problem with this, okay? I've mentioned this in other videos, and I've been all over Homebrew Talk and other boards talking about the shortcoming here. The inside diameter, okay, is under 3/8 of an inch. Here, it's 0.3 inches. If I go to fractions, you can see that it's 5/16 ID. All right, now we spend a lot of money using 1/2-inch ID silicone tubing. We put 1/2-inch ball valves, full flow ball valves. Right, we want to make sure that that interior is at least a 1/2 inch all the way through, so we don't cheap out on, you know, reduced port ball valves. So this is sort of useless. Now look at the hole inside there. You see the gasket where the gasket ends? That gasket opening is a little bigger than 1/2 inch. Now look at that tiny hole in there. That's even smaller than 5/16. All right. As far as I'm concerned, if you want to get away with it and go quick and cheap, this is the way to go. But it's definitely not my preference. I carry these at brewhardware.com just because I know people will want the simple way out in some cases. So I do have these, but I don't recommend them if there are other ways you can go. Now, another way people have been going, and I don't know who started the idea. I certainly looked at it in the review video 2 years ago. But you can take your silicone tubing and really aggressively force it over these threads. Now these threads are 1/2-inch MPT, and their OD is like 0.84 or something like that. Let me just okay, so it's about 0.82. All right, we're pretty close to 7/8 of an inch here, and silicone is 1/2-inch ID, but it's so flexible that you can force this over here. In fact, here is, let me see if I can get a nice close-up for you. Alright, so there's the same thread diameter on the street elbow with the hose forced over. Now doing this does mar the interior of the hose. If you took this off, you'd see that it was pretty messed up, but a lot of people don't mind forcing it over the threads and then putting a clamp on this. Sometimes they leak. If this is on the pressure side of a pump, especially between a pump and a plate chiller, these can pop off. I had one of these pop off and spray my ankle with boiling wort. Certainly put a hose clamp on here if you're going to do this, and it still might leak because the liquid follows the threads. It keeps going around and around and eventually comes out here. If you wrap this with Teflon tape ahead of time, there's a possibility to stop it altogether, or you can grind the threads down. Alright, so that was one thing that people would do, is just take a Type B. Again, it's cheap because you're only buying one fitting. You force this tubing over there and throw a clamp on it, and the only issue with that is that most connections are going to occur horizontally, and then when the hose gets full of liquid, it tends to kink the hose a little bit. So that's why in the past I had suggested that threading a street elbow onto the Type B was a practical way of dealing with the kinking problem. See, so when it goes onto your vessel, it hangs straight down, so the weight of the hose doesn't affect it. Okay? And of course, the biggest reason why you would do this is to get away from that tiny 5/16 ID barb. The diameter of the ID of this is like 5/8 of an inch. So it's even bigger than the hose, so you don't have as much restriction. And it's bad enough that you're already going through an elbow or a curve because it does provide a restriction, so going with a small ID is even worse. Alright, one other alternative, not as cheap because it requires an additional fitting, is to use the Type D, alright, with 1/2-inch MPT female threads, and then pick up a 5/8 hose barb. This is 1/2-inch pipe thread to 5/8 outside diameter barb. And you thread this in here. Now in cases where you don't mind coming straight out of the port on whatever device you're coming from, even though this is 1/2-inch tubing and 5/8 barb, again, if you can stretch it over 0.82 or close to 7/8, of course it will go over the 5/8 barb. Okay, throw a clamp on there, you're good to go. Now you're adding the price of the barb to the price of the coupling fitting here, but it's really not that much more expensive given how much extra flow you get. Now look how big that is. That's at least a 1/2 inch in diameter. Now, one of the coolest things about having a business bringing brewing hardware to everybody is that I can see problems with some of the existing stuff out there and try to improve on it and get it into everyone's hands. I tried making something like this in my own shop by grinding the threads off of the street elbows. Now, it didn't look this good, of course. It was really ugly here, and the metal was rough and everything, and there was no barb anymore. But I started having these manufactured to solve the problem. It's really the best of both worlds. You get an extremely high flow inside diameter. Just in case you were wondering, the ID of the barb end is just under 5/8 of an inch. So you do have to expand this tubing over it, and it's not the easiest thing to do, but it's certainly easier than pushing it over the threads. You just aggressively push it on, and once you get it started, it just takes a little bit of wrestling with it. You can rotate it on there and it slides up rather easily. So this is really, in my mind, the best solution to the problem. You get the elbow so that the tubing doesn't kink, and you get the incredibly high flow that we were looking for with the street elbows, but with a nice smooth barb here that doesn't ruin your tubing and it doesn't cause leaks. Now, you still want to use clamps, and that's one of the things I recently brought in as well. These are Breeze Industrial, all stainless clamps. Everything is stainless down to the screw, and they are also lined. I'm not sure if you can tell, but when you look inside that band, you don't see the slots. Here's a clamp from Home Depot, and when you tighten this around silicone, what happens is the tubing extrudes out of each of these slots, and you sort of ruin your tubing over time. You can see that this band, this has the same slots, but on the inside it's got a plain stainless band that goes all the way around, so no matter how tight you make this, you don't mar your tubing up. Alright, so I just thought I'd mention that, you know, you might want to think about using a clamp that has a wider band on it and has the liner. I do have these at Brew Hardware as well, and you can see you get nice full coverage on that barb when you use it like this. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we wrap this video up is the interior of your kettles. Now, this is specific to converted kegs because these dip tubes are designed so that they can reach into the center of the keg first of all, and then down to the bottom dish, because your bulkhead is usually installed, you know, some 3.5 inches off the very bottom of the keg. Now, most vendors out there in the homebrewing community sell these, and that's cool. The problem is that they usually use 1/2 inch OD stainless tubing, and in order to get this nice clean bend here, you have to use some slightly thicker walled tubing. So, for example, 0.035 wall is pretty common, and when you add those two up, you get a little over a 1/16 of an inch. So if you have a 1/2 inch OD and a little over 1/16 of an inch of wall thickness, you can see that you end up with somewhere in the neighborhood of a 7/16 inside diameter, and that's less than 1/2 inch. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to worry about the flow and how wide of an aperture you have all the way between the kettle and your pump or whatever else device you're going to, when the first foot of travel is through a restricted ID. For that reason, I've gone straight to 5/8 OD, which provides more than a 1/2 inch ID. It's actually 9/16 inside diameter. So this is an all-in-one compression bulkhead. The manufacturers who specialize in compression tube fittings and instrument fittings have similar devices, but it's configured slightly differently. The way this works is there's a captured silicone gasket here against this large hex. You put this into the hole in your kettle from the inside so that the gasket sits against the wall. Then you put this washer, and this just keeps the nut from scratching up the outside of your pot. And then you take a lock nut and you thread it down. You take your dip tube, and I use silicone O-rings here instead of metal ferrules because I like the fact that this will seal with hand tight. You don't have to get the wrenches out to take this thing out and put it back in. If you just make it hand tight, that stays in, it doesn't rotate, and it's leak free. It holds a siphon. So the last thing you're left to do with, now that, say this is your keg wall, this is all you see is the washer and the lock nut. You take your ball valve and you go ahead and thread it on there. Now you're going to use some Teflon tape on the ball valve connection, but you don't have to anywhere else, okay? So that's that assembly. I'm going to wrap this video up before it gets too dark out here, but I want to first stress that I hope this didn't sound too much like a Brew Hardware infomercial. I realize there is a bit of an advertising spin to this, but as a home brewer, a lot of these things that I've been coming up with are fixes to problems I had myself in my own brewery. So I'm putting slightly more money into developing the larger parts and the larger elbow hose barb and things like that, because these are things that I want to use in my brewery. So, you know, advertising or not, I recommend these things. I recommend upsizing as much of your fittings as possible to avoid cavitating your pump. Integrating pumps into your brewery is a big learning curve, and it is a source of frustration for people who just purchase them. And I know that the pump vendors like Chugger Pumps, you know, a lot of their customer service time goes into troubleshooting cavitation problems and loss of prime and things like that, and it's always related to the plumbing that's involved, especially the input side of the pump. So upsizing things, making small adjustments, and spending a couple more dollars on the larger flow dip tube and hose barbs and things like that really go a long way to avoiding these problems altogether. I want to make sure that you're aware that these exist. You can modify components. You can have things custom manufactured. So anyway, I hope this was informative above everything else, and I'm definitely interested in knowing what your feedback is on the new parts that I've come up with. Talk to you later, guys.